So hi, welcome to this session. We're going to be talking about the interactions between curriculum development and teacher professional learning. To start, we'll just introduce ourselves. So I'm Emily Perry. I'm a Professor of Education at Sheffield Institute of Education, which is part of Sheffield Hallam University. I've been working for a long time now on teacher professional development and curriculum development projects. I lead that kind of work in our education department. And as a result of working on a series of these kinds of projects over the years, I've started to get interested in how they interact with each other and how they overlap and where the overlaps are and what that means. In addition to that, before I started working at the university, I was a teacher in a number of different schools. And so like all teachers, I spent a significant amount of my time developing curriculum materials and teaching activities. And looking back on that, it raises some questions for me about how I learned to do that and where I learned those skills. I'm joined today by Eleanor Hotham, who's going to introduce herself. She's one of our PhD students. Eleanor.
Hi, yes, I'm Eleanor Hotham, and I'm setting out on my PhD studies, having recently completed an MRes in social science, in which I focused on the relationship between curriculum making and professional learning practices in my dissertation project. Moving forward, these themes actually form the basis of my PhD study too. I became interested in the connections between these two areas through my own experience as a primary school teacher, during which time I experienced many approaches to each of these areas, and I recognised points of interaction that fueled my research interests.
Thanks, Eleanor. So in this session, we'll set the scene, considering why we think this is an issue worth exploring. We'll then each share findings from some studies we've been carrying out relating to the issues, and then we'll end by considering some of the implications, and like always in these sessions, we'll raise some questions for further research and talk about what we might be doing next. So to start with then, curriculum development. I think everyone who's been a teacher or worked with teachers will know that they spend a significant amount of time developing, planning, organising their curriculum. And that is actually an expectation, certainly in England, of teachers' professional roles. You can see on the slide there an extract from the DfE's Teacher Standards, which sets out what teachers are expected to do in terms of curriculum development. How that happens is different in different schools and different contexts and different subject areas, depending on the choices that schools and teachers are making around for example, buying in curriculum materials or developing their own, or often working kind of those two things in combination. What this does, as we've been saying, is raises some questions for us. So what knowledge do teachers need to be able to carry out this kind of curriculum development activity? Where do they get this knowledge from? How do they know, for example, how to promote a love of learning or design an engaging curriculum? What ways is that different for different subject areas, different phases, different areas of specialism that teachers might hold, different pedagogical approaches within different subjects? And one of the things that we've started to become interested in is how do teachers learn how to do this? Where do they get this knowledge from? And also, as they're doing it, what do they learn from it? And so we've started to wonder if there's a kind of cycle of learning how to do this and then learning from doing it. In relation to teachers' professional learning, we've realised that there are many professional development activities and programmes that contain some kind of engagement with curriculum materials. On the slide are just some extracts pulled from the internet, from various websites, where you can see a variety of CPD programmes being advertised. And you can see that they're suggesting a range of ways in which teachers might engage with curriculum materials through that professional development programme. These are from a variety of subjects and phases. They're pretty randomly chosen. What we've seen is that there are a range of different ways in which teachers might engage with curriculum materials through professional development activities. So in some examples, they're given a set of materials that they'll just pick up and use by the programme facilitators. They might be working with programme facilitators to adapt or develop existing materials, or they might be developing completely new materials, and often in these kinds of programmes they'll be supported by programme facilitators. There seems to be a bit of an assumption that this engaging with curriculum materials is just a good thing. And what we're wondering is not whether or not that is the case, I also think it is a good thing, but really what does that mean? So what are the intentions of the programme facilitators when they're saying to teachers, you're going to use these curriculum materials? What are teachers actually learning when they're engaging with curriculum materials in these ways? What roles are the curriculum materials playing in this learning? And what happens next as teachers take the curriculum materials and continue to adapt them or take them and try to use them in their practice? So pulling those two things together, and you can see that as we've described them, they're pretty overlapping already. There's a set of questions which start to emerge, some of which I've just touched on. So on the left-hand side of the screen, there are questions about curriculum development and the knowledge that is needed to engage in curriculum development and the knowledge that is gained from engaging in curriculum development. And on the right-hand side of the screen, some questions about professional learning and how engaging with curriculum materials through professional learning might help teachers further. So in the next part of the session, what we'll do is share examples from a couple of studies where we have been exploring some of these questions. So this first study I'm going to introduce, and then I'll pass to Eleanor after this, who's going to describe some of the findings from the work she's been doing. In this study, what we've been doing is looking at teachers engaging with curriculum materials in a professional development programme. I'm using the definition of curriculum materials on the slide there, so you can see it encompasses a range of possible things that might be used by teachers in schools to help them to design and carry out, plan and deliver their lessons. We already know, and we've done a bit of analysis of this in the study, the kinds of things that curriculum materials do. So they're complex materials. They encode a lot of practices within schools around subject, content, pedagogical approaches. Often they contain information about schools' values and the way that they desire to work with particular groups of children or all the children in their school. So they're complex materials in themselves. You can see on the bottom of the slide there a quote from some of our colleagues actually at Sheffield Hallam saying some of the things that we've been discussing already, that the relationship between using new curriculum materials and professional learning is quite under-researched. But again, they suggest that it does seem likely that engaging with curriculum materials leads to some form of professional learning. And that's something we've been trying to explore in this study. So we've taken a programme that was funded by the EEF called Integrating English. It was a trial of an approach to teaching the grammar, the register, the genre of school subjects in primary schools through a particular pedagogical approach which had been developed in Australia already. You can see some information about it if you're interested on the slide there. Sheffield Hallam colleagues were appointed to evaluate that programme. And that's where we kind of came into it. It had 90 schools engaged in England. You can see on the slide there, 4,700 people. So it was a big study, a big trial that took place. What's important from this perspective is in the programme, teachers were supported by facilitators to develop their own curriculum materials. They came out of school to do that. They worked with the trainers of the programme, and then they took those materials back into school. So we developed, as you can see on the slide, a sort of linear approach to considering what was happening in this programme. So the teachers were presented with a set of curriculum materials by the programme facilitators, and then they were supported by those trainers, the facilitators, to use them or to develop their own schemes of work, their own curriculum materials based on those kind of exemplars that had been presented. They were intended, the curriculum materials, the kind of first ones that were presented, as models of this particular approach to teaching and how they could be used in schools. And we started to think of those as, you might call them, boundary objects between the old practice and the new practice that was being used in schools, or as research mediators or research translators, where they were translating the research that had been done by the programme trainers, programme facilitators, into the practices that they were going to use in schools. A question that this raises is really, what were those materials doing in that professional development programme? Could the teachers have taken on the new approaches without having to engage with the curriculum materials in some way? Or could they even have just picked up and used the curriculum materials without the professional development? But it seemed like the programme trainers, and this is what we see in a lot of professional development programmes, the programme trainers, the facilitators, they felt that using the curriculum materials was really important. And so we were interested to understand why that was. So we took some of the data that had been collected as part of the evaluation. We analysed interviews from teachers and school leaders in 13 of the schools to have a look at how the curriculum materials are being used and what happened as a result of that. And we found a variety of things, really. So there were different outcomes in different schools. So in some schools, the materials just picked up and were used. They were dropped straight into the curriculum, these new curriculum materials. In other places, they were adapted. Teachers kind of picked and chose different pieces, bits and pieces that they wanted out of the curriculum materials. And then in other places, the schools found that they couldn't use the materials, they just didn't fit. So even though they'd chosen to engage in this professional development programme, they knew what it was about, they still then struggled to actually adopt these new practices. So what I'm going to do in the next 3 slides is just talk you through an example of each of those types of outcomes from 3 of the schools that were involved in the study and that we took the interviews from. So in this first school, this was a school where they really felt that the materials were something that would contribute to their development plans. So they'd already identified an issue in their schools. They used these curriculum materials and they used this opportunity to really change their practice. And you can see those quotes on the slide. The new curriculum materials, as a result of engaging in this professional development programme, these new curriculum materials were influencing the curriculum across all the different subjects and all the different phases in this school. These are primary schools, by the way. One reason for this seemed to be that they'd already identified this kind of approach as something that they wanted to develop. And so these curriculum materials, they appeared to align with the school's priorities, their school's aims. And the process was really supported by school leaders. So teachers were given time back in school to work together. And you'll hear this from Eleanor, actually, to work together to develop these curriculum materials for the purposes of their school. And we saw that in a few schools. In another group of schools, we saw that teachers were choosing what they wanted from the materials. So there was more of a mixed type of outcome. You can see that teacher on the left there saying we just pick and choose what we need. So they've taken their existing curriculum materials and they've dropped these new ideas into those existing curriculum materials. In some places they did fit with their aims, but in other places they felt, oh, actually this piece of this material is not for me. So they were choosing what worked for them and fitting it into what they were doing already. And then in the last group of schools, and this was the smallest group of schools, there were not many where this happened. It seemed that schools, the teachers, they tried to take these new materials, but they found some barriers along the way. And they didn't just dismiss the materials. You can see in these quotes, the one on the left, the teachers worked with the facilitators of the professional development programme to try and make these materials work, but they just couldn't find a way to get them to fit into their existing curriculum. Sometimes that was because they just didn't have space with what they were doing already. They had a bought-in curriculum, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, the Success for All curriculum, and so they couldn't find any space to put any new materials into there. In other schools, we found that there were some external practices, for example, Year 6 SATs, so standardised tests run by the government effectively, which meant that they just couldn't find the time within preparing children for those tests to put these new materials in. So there were a variety of outcomes, and one thing that this tells us, which is interesting, is that even though these teachers had all engaged with curriculum materials in the same way, the outcomes of that engagement were different in different schools. And that leads us to thinking about the complexity of professional development in itself, and some of these things we already know about. The professional development and outcomes can be very complex. It seems like there is not a kind of linear process like we suggested on a slide earlier. It's much more iterative than that. In some places, the facilitators of the professional development programme, they gave more support. That didn't necessarily lead to greater change. In some places, the teachers found ways to use the materials, and in other places they effectively rejected the new materials. So they didn't develop in the sense of professional development from engaging with the curriculum materials. In some places, the curriculum that already existed in school did not allow space for the new materials. And in some places, the school itself, the culture and the organisational arrangements, the developmental priorities in the school had an influence on whether and how the teachers were able to use these new materials. So there's a complexity in there, and we'll keep coming back to that idea of complexity. It runs throughout this whole presentation. A non-linear arrangement, the way these things do or don't lead to changes in practice, the way they do or don't lead to teachers' professional development, their professional learning. I'll come back to some of these questions towards the end. What I'm going to do now is hand over to Eleanor, who's going to talk through the findings of her study, which looks again at the relationship between curriculum development and professional learning. So Eleanor, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Brilliant, thank you, Emily. Okay, so as I briefly mentioned at the start, this study was undertaken for a recent research project, and it forms the basis of my PhD, focusing on curriculum making and professional learning practices. And you can see the full title of this recent project there on the slide. So I was working with a large primary school in South Yorkshire, which is itself part of a 6-school academy trust, and I worked with them across 2 school terms. What I did was I used an instrumental case study design to explore the relationship between the practices of teacher curriculum making and their professional learning. So the school presented a really interesting opportunity for exploring these 2 themes, having both a project-based thematic curriculum and also an active focus on teachers themselves being learners. So the profile and the visibility of these approaches to curriculum making and also to professional learning within the school ensured that I got a really clear picture of the processes of, and also I suppose the relationship between these 2 areas of the teacher's practice. So I was working with the school's lower key stage 2 team, so that's year 3 and 4 teachers, and I was able to observe and discuss different aspects of curriculum making, which would include the selection and sequencing of objectives, and also to observe and discuss related professional learning, which would include collaborative working. Okay, so the next slide, please, Emily. Thank you. So just as a brief aside, before I move to discuss kind of the theoretical grounding to this study, it's important to recognise that the terminology around both curriculum and professional learning is really contested. So often it can be characterised as either development or design, that's curriculum, but here I'm going to use the term curriculum making to represent both the intentions and also the enactment of the curriculum, which is a kind of a broad perspective represented in Stenhouse. This focus does also relate to Bernstein's 3 message systems of curriculum, pedagogy and assessment, with curriculum and pedagogy featuring really centrally to this study in particular. There are similar contentions around the terminology in relation to professional development or professional learning, and it's the latter one I'm going to use here, so professional learning, in order to focus on kind of individual and personal growth of the teachers. So back to the relationship, there is currently a real dearth of literature providing a kind of balanced account of this relationship between the practices of curriculum making and professional learning. But it is possible to kind of begin to tease out points of connection from the 2 fields. So, for example, as listed on the slide, you'll see curriculum making involves interaction with disciplinary structures, which itself requires specialist teacher knowledge of those structures. Further, as outlined by Priestley et al., teachers' practice of interpreting and reconstructing the curriculum documents is a further aspect of curriculum making, which can be understood as being reliant on their professional knowledge too. So how they kind of interact with given curriculum documents, such as the national curriculum. From a professional learning perspective, it is also possible to draw out a distinction between formal and informal models, as you'll see there on the slide. And with links to curriculum, the former may include qualifications linked to curriculum making, or even kind of teachers' subject specialisms, with the latter informal kind covering instances of group curriculum making. So then below there, at the interface of these 2 fields, arise the questions which were posed earlier by Emily, which form the backbone of the discussion of this case study. with the intention of bringing together the fields of professional learning and curriculum making in relation to teacher practices in this specific context. Okay, so next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that I undertook a case study approach, working alongside a group of Year 3 and 4 teachers within the selected school. So then, in order to focus the research in a bit further, I was looking specifically at their thematic cross-curricular curriculum making and the related professional learning, which is actually a central point of this school and actually the Academy Chain as a whole, their approach to the curriculum. So in order to build up the case study, I observed teachers at a really crucial stage in their curriculum making process. So that was during an off timetable whole day planning session in which they created an overview of an upcoming unit of work. I also analysed a range of the school documents related to curriculum and also professional learning, as well as interviewing both teaching staff and school leadership. Okay, so what then did this case study bring to light in relation to the relationship between professional learning and curriculum making practices? A key overarching theme, which has already been recognised by Emily, is that inherent complexity of this relationship. So then I move on to kind of consider how this complexity is manifested. What does it tell us about the nature of the relationship and of teacher experience as well? So the following points outlined there on the slide begin to illustrate the findings of the study. So firstly, it was demonstrated that teachers were working with and between disciplines or subjects which required specialised professional knowledge. Further, teachers used their professional knowledge to transform the prescribed national curriculum into their thematically linked school curriculum, which they term their expeditions. So that's their vocabulary for the units of work. And then in addition to this, there is a specific culture of curriculum making within the school, which enables teachers to work collaboratively and to learn from each other as a form of socialised or social learning. Okay, so to look at that first point in a little bit more detail, the case study revealed connections between teachers working with disciplines or subjects and their professional knowledge. So as you can see here from some quotes from the teachers and the leadership, they both discussed disciplinary aspects, such as selecting certain elements of the history curriculum for different units of work, as well as the school leadership leader there discussing making interdisciplinary links between subjects. And then here looking at the thematically structured school curriculum. So during both interviews, both teachers and school leaders suggested connections between the thematic approach that they use in the school and teacher professional knowledge. So as demonstrated there on the slide, a classroom teacher made the connection between their ability to group, to sequence and to order the national curriculum objectives and to a degree of kind of their personal autonomy in doing so, which implied the use of their professional knowledge. Further, as you'll see there from the second quote, a school leader shared how they had structured a staff meeting, kind of a professional learning episode, to encourage teachers to make these interdisciplinary links in their curriculum making and to do so to employ their professional knowledge and judgments. And then finally, from a professional learning perspective, the teachers shared that they really valued and then indeed gained a lot from working with their colleagues to create the curriculum. The ways in which they verbalised and shared the curriculum making process together was really also apparent in the observation of the curriculum making itself that I did as part of the case study. And I saw the teachers building on each other's ideas through kind of these really detailed discussions of curriculum sequencing and objective selection. Okay, so what can we draw from these findings? I mean, it's fairly clear that from a small scale case study such as this, generalizations are somewhat impossible, but you know, conclusions can be approached kind of with caution. So there is evidence within the study of that complex multifaceted relationship between professional learning practices and curriculum making practices. But as I say, whilst the study has begun to kind of unpick this relationship, it raises many more questions about areas of further research, which I hope myself to develop in my upcoming PhD research. So kind of the first point for further exploration is that this study is obviously very reflective of a very specific school context in which it's based. So further research should explore a range of school settings, which may help to kind of foster a comparison between approaches to curriculum making and professional learning in relation to this relationship. I think it would also be really beneficial to consider what may be kind of effective practice for curriculum making and professional learning, and how this effective practice may impact the relationship between the two areas as well. And then finally, a study of kind of greater scope than this could follow curriculum making practices and the related professional learning over a longer period of time, and actually explore the curriculum making chronologically as it happens. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleanor. So what we've done here is just give you a brief glimpse into a couple of studies that we've been carrying out around the interactions between how teachers develop the curriculum, how they develop new curriculum materials, and how teachers engage in professional learning or professional development. Eleanor touched on the complexity of both of those kind of terms, the terminology used around them, and we haven't talked about that much, but obviously you might want to think about different forms of professional learning and how that might affect the way that the curriculum is developed, or different, as Eleanor kind of mentioned, different forms of the curriculum, and again how that might affect teachers' professional learning. I think one thing that we've learned from these two early studies, and they're both at early stages really, and there's a lot more to explore, which Eleanor's touched on and I'll come back to in a second, is that there is a relationship between these two things, and that relationship, as we mentioned earlier, is under researched, it's under studies, it's barely acknowledged actually. And therefore it's undervalued in the system, the way in which these two things can and do interact. They're both key parts of teachers' practices, but it seems like people aren't really exploring yet how those two things interact with each other. We've learned just from these two studies so far that the relationship is really complicated. There's a lot going on in there. It's non-linear, and that each influences the other. So engaging in curriculum development, it is clear leads to some form of professional learning. And also that professional development activity, professional development programs, professional learning, whether informal or formal, can lead to teachers engaging in curriculum development. And we know that that often happens. What we're not clear of still really is how that happens. There's a range of factors influencing the interactions between teachers' professional learning and curriculum development. And some of those are on the slide there. They won't be a surprise to most people watching this session. I'm sure, you know, these are things that we already know influence the ways in which teachers go about their professional development, or the way that which teachers develop their practice. We've got factors relating to the school and their practices and their values, and the policies that were already in place in schools. We've got factors relating to the system. So Eleanor mentioned the national curriculum. I mentioned Year 6 SATs. There are all kinds of influences which will have an effect on the interactions between teachers, professional learning and curriculum development. We've got the teachers themselves, their values and their beliefs, their existing knowledge, the ways that they enact their practice already, and how that might then change as a result of either professional learning and or curriculum development. I think one thing that we're bringing out here is the importance of the curriculum in this. So Eleanor's case study was of a particular school with a particular approach to the curriculum. And one thing that she'll go on to explore next, or that she mentioned that she might go on to explore next, is how that might look different in different schools. And there are other things within there, other complexities again to explore. So would it look different with different subjects, different phases, different curriculum intentions? So what really does the school want to achieve in its curriculum? Different models of approaching the curriculum and how they go about teaching the children in their context. So, and that's really adding something, I think, to how these things might interact with each other. So what's going to happen next is, well, Eleanor's going to go off and finish her PhD. We've got more to explore around the way that teachers engage in these processes, and again, is it different for different teachers? We'll be looking at the different school contexts that I just mentioned. There may be differences to explore in terms of subject areas and different phases. So there's a lot for us to go at. Hopefully we'll be able to report back at these, back from these at some future events. We hope it's interesting. We know that this session is for people who are interested in the curriculum, but I hope you've been able to find something interesting and think about how teachers in these contexts go about developing the curriculum. For now, I think we'll just say thank you for listening to this session. Thank you, Eleanor, for contributing.
Thank you, Emily.
It's really interesting to hear from your studies. I hope you found it useful, and thank you very much.